Hello and welcome to Beyond Top 10 Tennis. My name is Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge and I'm your host. I'm the author of 11 books, a CEO of 12 years, the founder of a startup set on data privacy, but most importantly, an elite performance coach of over 18 years, having worked with athletes throughout Europe, the United States to Australia. And of course, most excitingly, I am the world's leading scientist on coach and athlete performance, specifically behind how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking. My work includes everything from mitigating injuries to conditioning behaviors that set a player up long-term for the long game towards a top 10 tennis ranking. I'm behind theories from the optimal performance theory, optimal behavior for optimal performance, the barrier breaker, the rule of transference to the golden rule. As has become custom, each episode we dive into one of my books to share additional insights and dig a little bit deeper. We've been focusing on the secrets to optimal performance success, a comprehensive discussion on developing elite coaches and players. We have over 30 episodes now to date, and today's episode actually marks episode number 40. So, oh my goodness, how far we've come. Today's topic, it plays its own role, like so many other episodes, in developing the player, parent to coach for that road ahead towards a top 10 tennis ranking. So, as always, buckle in and enjoy the ride. Thank you so much for joining us today. I don't know about you, but I'm so excited that we've reached 40 episodes. For those of you who have been with us from the very beginning, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. For those of you who are just joining us, that's wonderful. Thank you so much as well. But from the very beginning, 40 episodes. I wasn't actually too sure we would get this far because this was a new project that I took on, and I've been wanting to do it for some time. And when I say some time, I mean the last few years. And by few years specifically, probably 7, almost 8 years, when initially someone said to me, a close friend, that I should dive into and commence a podcast. And I had too many competing priorities at that time. I was probably publishing my second book, and then the third one came, and you know the rest how it goes, and we got to number 11, and this year was the year where I finally just took a moment and stopped and thought, I guess I can do this. And I have touched on this in the last couple of episodes, despite actually working on my latest book as well, so number 12. But even though I have touched on it, I am trying to give myself the space to build this, to talk with you all about Beyond Top 10 Tennis. And as much as I would love to make that deadline and have that book published this year, because every year for the last 8 years I have released 1 or sometimes 2 books. There's actually only been 2 years where I've actually only published 1 book, 2 to 3 years, and the other, I think there's 5 in there where 4 in there were multiple. So I haven't really come up for air. And I think for those of you out there who may be very similar, that you don't know when to stop, or you do stop, but there's always another project underway. Obviously throughout this time frame, as I mentioned in the introduction, that startup was created and built, and AMA International has also gone through many changes over that time, and even last year was my fictional release, and that was a new project in and of itself. So I just wanted to say a big thank you, because the competing priorities I'm sure we all have, and some of us handle them better than others. I'm sure I'm guilty of at times not handling them the best and really just pumping the work out. And I think that's why it's so important to share these insights through Beyond Top 10 Tennis, that ironically, hopefully it does end up being a positive outcome in tandem with my latest body of work, which essentially has been 10 years also in the making, which is an extensive period of time. But I think, look, today's episode, obviously, if you're new to this, we've been focusing on the secrets to optimal performance success, but we touched on, we started about 2 episodes back, chapter 6, the proponents of best practice, and it's actually the final chapter in this book. And so there's a little bit of pressure there, because I want to make sure that I guess for all of you out there, you understand how valuable this book is, because at the end of the day, it was my first publication that actually came out just before I officially received my doctorate. It did actually come out after I had been awarded it. However, there's a bit of a process where you have to obviously wait for that formalized. Anyway, today's topic, it's really carrying off last week's topic, and it's about respecting yourself as a coach. And if you want to follow along, we are on page 210. This is such an important topic, and we really like, and I want to make sure that the common, I think, theme in all of now 40 episodes is that humanized approach. Because irrespective if you're heading towards that top 10 tennis ranking, and you've heard about the rule of transference I've touched on in the introductions, and it's really about that transferable approach. So the humanized approach is really just that, because as in life, we really need to ensure in the best possible way that we are respecting ourselves. And irrespective if it's as a coach, as a professional, in a different sporting dynamic, as a parent, as a teacher, irrespective, I think, of what you choose to do or what you do, the one piece that you get to control, obviously we can go intrinsic feedback here, is that self-respect. And there's so many offshoots there, and I think many facets just wrapped up all into that. And I think a bit of a tangent here is that, and hopefully it's interesting for a lot of you out there, is that all of this work, so the body of work that I've built upon, is actually wrapped up in human behavior. Because at the end of the day, we really need to pull apart what it really takes to develop that top 10 tennis ranking, so that player, but that's also responsible and or applicable for that coach. So a player does not get to a top 10 tennis ranking overnight, and obviously not by themselves. And we've got the data that obviously backs that up. And it's incredibly rewarding, exciting as well when we look at the rule of transference and its applicability in life. So one of my latest books, The Secrets to Optimal Performance Success, we started to use that cross-section of elite performance and obviously elite outcomes in life. So whether it's different facets, so it could be tennis, it could be cricket, it could be netball in the sporting domain, for example. But then professionally, you may be that coach in tennis, but you may be that coach in basketball, you may be that coach in NFL, and or you just may be that professional irrespective of what domain. We know the practices that are embedded in achieving that status as the 1%. And that is incredibly exciting, Though when we're looking at humanized approach, it's right there in front of us, and the tools that we get to learn and harness obviously have those incredible outcomes. And when we're wrapping up human behavior, we're really digging deeper, which includes obviously that self-respect and obviously that ability for intrinsic to extrinsic feedback, for example. But we're looking at, for example, that coaching pedagogy and what's incorporated in that. So your morals and your values, which today's episode, I think, really dives into. Though when we take it back and, we strip that down to the core fundamentals, to foundations of human behavior, it really comes down to your makeup. And when I say your makeup, we know how you're shaped, so the work that goes into that. Now, there are some people who might say that they're more advantaged than others, and others who are at a disadvantage, and it really rings true. However, it's really how you respond to that. And I'm sure I'm not saying anything new in this respect, though, and especially for those familiar with human behavior, because this work actually covers psychology, and obviously it comes under human behavior. It comes under learning theory, so multiple learning theories, which crosses from whether it's the philosophical side, the psychological side, to obviously that more human movement, and everything's wrapped up under that, as well as the educational side, because we need to look at how you learn, and how you learn is going to be different to the person next to you and how they learn. And it comes back to the conditioning proponents. So what is your normal is also going to be different to the other person's what is their normal. And we can habitualize that. So we build that habit. So that's a conditioning approach, which is ingrained to embedded within the given framework of choice. Now, I know that sounds a bit complex, but essentially what it's saying is that however you learn the best, you need to couple that with that coaching pedagogy that accommodates that if you're the player. If you obviously aspire to achieve this, then you need to obviously ensure that learning a schematic behind that complements that. And I also acknowledge that's vague because I'm trying to make sure that I'm not being too explicit, so every listener can choose what is that and or this for them. Anyway, that is a lot. When we want to really look at the element of respecting and obviously self-respect, that really dives into, say, one example is self-worth and everything that I think is wrapped onto that. And that really comes down to your level of consciousness, to your level of awareness. And there are a lot of buzzwords around that. But we can look at your self-esteem and how that's wrapped up into your self-worth and your different values, and it comes down to how you value yourself opposed to relying on other people where you would get that validation from, which unfortunately one too many people fall into that. And it's not saying it's your fault. It's more of a case of that's what you've been exposed to, and or that is what you've perceived and or view as your normal. And when we want to change that normal to a more healthier approach where your self-worth is internal, so no one else can control that self-worth and or no one else can manipulate and or change that, is that you are comfortable in your own skin, and obviously the steps you can take to get there. So this is really ingrained in that humanized approach. And at the end of the day, every tennis player, every tennis coach is a human. irrespective also of what level you're at, whether you are that developing 12, 13, 14-year-old, you are winning junior grand slams, and or you are, top 50 in the world, top 10 in the world. Irrespective, we're all individuals, we are all humans, and we have the capacity to optimize those outcomes. So obviously that's a play on words there when we're looking at the title of this book, The Secrets to Optimal Performance Success. Now, whilst we use tennis as the blueprint, those of you who have been with us for some time are familiar with obviously the crossovers there. Now, we are focusing on tennis and obviously how we get to that top 10 tennis ranking. And you're thinking, well, how does that self-worth tie in? That's essentially the other side, and that comes back to your belief system and different metrics intertwined with that. Because on one hand, of course, it is to do with those technical proponents, so your physical performance, though you have that emotional and mental side. Now, we do have episodes that touch on mental conditioning, which also crosses over into mental health. And when we're looking at your emotional well-being, it really crosses over there as well, but also maybe more so, depending on your views and to perspectives, we could look at your self-respect. So respecting yourself and how that ties in to your self-worth. And I think the discussion on self-worth is incredibly interesting, incredibly valuable. It is something personally that I have been working on this year, when it was brought to my attention that there was a bit of a blip, that maybe my self-worth was not as high as I thought it was. And I'm sure for many out there, was a shock, that I was almost quite disappointed in myself that I had allowed that to happen. And it kind of caught me off guard. And I was not conscious that was the case. And when this person pointed out different areas where I was potentially susceptible for my self-worth not being that champion front and center, I could see what they were saying and obviously validate that that's actually correct. And that, unfortunately, unbeknownst to me, that level of self-worth wavered. And this is really to say that I can share the personal side, and that's coming from someone who thought their self-worth was right up there, especially being responsible for sharing how it underpins that top 10 tennis ranking and the long game and the pathway that hopefully you're all familiar with by now. So that's to say that potentially you could be like me, where you think that your self-worth is it's unbreakable, it's unshakable, it is rock solid. And that's kudos to you. But just have a recheck. And for those of you out there who know that they're actually actively working on it, it's not where they would like to be, that's okay. I think that's what it's all about. Because again, with the tangent, is that when we're looking at growth, we can look at performative growth, and that's obviously progressions. And that's, 900 in the world, 700 in the world, 600 in the world, 250 in the world. That's a progression, and that's an incredible progression. And if those patterns continue, you'll get towards the top 10, whilst obviously integrating the 7 keys, which is incredibly rewarding and exciting. Now we're looking at how we transfer that when we're looking at self-respect and our self-worth. It all comes down to progressions. And it's really fun to talk about, I think, this performance metric that, even though it is obviously not physical, we can look at how it actually is attributed towards performance success and those obviously optimal outcomes. And so there are really valuable questions that you can ask yourself. And one of those, I think, important elements or facets is about boundaries. And you go, how does that apply to tennis? But bear with me, because you're going to have boundaries in that coach-athlete dynamic. And so we term that the coach-athlete relationship, where there are going to be boundaries there that you want to make sure are tight-knit, that support that partnership, so to speak, because ideally you want that to be unbreakable, that the two of you, the player and the coach, work that well together, you're that effective, because that coach's pedagogy is conscious of the 7 keys, so they're conscious of ingraining that, and you as that player then are very receptive to what they're sharing. And to have a better grasp of that, I would encourage you to listen to our previous episodes. So I'm trying to avoid doubling up in that respect. And so when you have that partnership, so to speak, we also know, which is incredibly fun to look at, the relationship and how to build the most successful relationships. And we look at that coach-athlete relationship, obviously from performance side, but we can also look at when we're using the rule of transference in life, whether it's between that child and the parent, employer and employee, but also between one partner and the other partner from that personal perspective. And it's incredibly rewarding and exciting if tennis is your niche and that's your core objective, and how you have all of these tools at your disposal that you can actually apply into life. And this is a lot, all of this is really wrapped up under the 7 keys to optimize your life. Obviously all those the links are in the episode notes always. But when we really, so we'll draw it back into our self-worth now and the boundaries. So boundaries are applicable in every relationship dynamic. So the professional to personal, you are responsible for setting them. And you go, okay, what are those boundaries? So those boundaries are responsible for your core values. So your moral compass, different attitudes, values, beliefs. So your actual, your personal discourse, and maybe they'll differ from your professional, though more often than not they're quite consistent. Though it's important to go, what are your core values and what's important to you, and what are you willing to compromise, what are you willing not to compromise on. Now a lot of this hopefully is resonating with the older listeners out there, so we'll say 18 years plus, when we're looking at the personal relationships that you have in life, whether it's with your friends, your family, your partner, your significant other, and how much applicable this is. To those under 18 years of age, and I'm just using this as a ballpark, it's important to also recognize your boundaries that you're setting with, I will narrow in on your friends, your family, but also how you can work on setting those boundaries with your coach, and to ensure that coach respects your boundaries as well. And that can amplify your own self-worth. So your personal, so off the tennis court, but your professional on the tennis court. And I know it can be a bit, maybe it's a little bit odd looking at professional if you're under 18 years of age, but it's a good separation there. Obviously, the older you are, and if you are that elite player, then tennis is your profession. Though, if tennis is not your profession and something else is, it's just as applicable to make sure you're incredibly conscious of that. And everyone out there is going to have values that are very different for their own reasons. And it really doesn't matter what they are. It's important for you to ask yourself those questions and to set those boundaries around that. Examples of a boundary may be that when you are on the tennis court, you want to make sure you are heard and that you are listened to, and that there's a very healthy mutual understanding there. And that is obviously a very open one that is applicable just as off the tennis court. So in your circle of friends, for example, one of your boundaries may be you want to make sure that you are listened to and heard, and the underlying principle there is that you will behave the same way. So when we're looking at those habitual behaviors there, and they're reciprocated, and so you can expect the same then if that's one of your boundaries on court of the coach. So irrespective of that age difference, whether it's child and adult, whether it's that 12-year-old and the older adult, the parent and their child, it's just as applicable to coach and athlete, coach and player. It's irrespective of the dynamic. It's important for the individual to be empowered, and that's essentially what we're talking about when we're looking at self-worth. More often than not, unfortunately, self-worth is not front and center. Now, self-worth can obviously be a little bit confounding, but it gets wrapped up and confused with then self-esteem. And self-esteem, I think, is commonly viewed as how you view not only yourself and how you are perceived as well, and different things that inflict on that could weaken how you feel about yourself, for example. And that is a very, very vague definition. Though when we're looking at your self-worth, it's very similar when we're looking at your values, but it's to do with those boundaries to expectations of yourself and others. But primarily, what you will permit to happen and what you won't. And it's incredibly important because, again, the discussion's about respect and respecting yourself, and that's essentially tied into self-worth. So what will you allow? What won't you allow? Will you allow someone to ignore you? Hopefully the answer is no. And so that could be a firm boundary. Is that one of the boundaries you would like to set with that other person if you're the player, and then to the coach is that I want to ensure that you do not ever ignore me. And that is one of my firm boundaries. The coach can say similar to say, this is a boundary that is an expectation of this relationship when we're talking about that coach-athlete relationship. And it's also just as applicable, you will see following along in those circles of friends. As another example is that you want to make sure you are heard. Now, these are very simple examples. They can obviously get a lot more deeper and a lot more personal depending on the situation, where you can look at cultural differences to cultural values. Irrespective, they are boundaries that you should feel confident and comfortable in setting, because that is who you are and it embodies the person you want to be and to be seen as. And at the end of the day, it's just as applicable for that tennis player. Okay, that was a lot. If you want to follow along, we are on page 210. And okay, here we go. We're going to share a couple of snippets and segments, and I really want you to keep front and center self-worth and how it's really intertwined with respecting yourself. And obviously, we're looking at that crossover with the coach. To all of the coaches out there, I want you to ask yourself this question truthfully. Do you respect yourself as a coach? This may appear on face value as a simple question with perhaps an answer that we would all share. However, I have to differ with this answer, as I know it is not as streamlined as many may think, or outsiders may come to suggest. Now, this really touches on is that I'm going to tend to disagree if out there you think all coaches respect themselves. And I will tell you why as we go on. Just as in business, coaching is no different. It is a profession. You are a professional. Coaches are considered as doing their time, mastering their craft, and as a result, just like others who have either studied or worked their way through to know what they are talking about, it is all business. We are all professionals in what we do, aren't we? Now, this is, I think, a bit of an offshoot in the best possible way, because when we're looking at being a professional in this respect, we want to make sure you're upskilling, that you're putting the work in, that you're abreast, that you're conscious of the 7 keys, which means if you are not conscious of the 7 keys, upskilling, and how it's tied into respecting yourself as a coach. You're putting the work in to hone your craft. You want to be the best version of yourself. So whether you're that player, you are that coach, you're that parent with your professional endeavors, irrespective, you're working on continuously improving, which obviously resonates with that player that wants to progress. But the coach, when we're looking at those growth milestones we touched on earlier, to make sure you're leading by example. And by doing that, you are putting the work in. Maybe not. This is the catch. Although we all should be professionals, being a professional is associated with your area of expertise, and we all differ here and have something unique to offer. By working to improve and grow as a professional, to master our craft in one way or another, or at least strive towards ascertaining this level of expertise, can only benefit the coaching community as a whole. Now, together, if we've got all the coaches out there working towards being the best that they can be, then the rewards for the players are exponential. If every coach out there, and that's one of my absolute goals, has access to the 7 keys, we know we can mitigate injuries in youth populations and progressing adolescents to teens, to showcase more healthier athletes with reduced injuries, so limiting that onset of injuries. And we also have an uptake of healthier populations, because that is associated with more activity, so increased uptake of the sport, because the likelihood of them developing an injury is substantially reduced, which allows them to continue to participate. And the coaches, if they've got access to the 7 keys, they know how to continuously engage that player, that athlete, that child, which means they're going to maintain their levels of activity in the sport, and potentially they're going to enjoy their sport just as much, that they will end up becoming a coach, some of them as well, and continuing the thread, so to speak. And it's all into work and wrapped up under the 7 keys, because the possibilities are incredible. They're exponential when we're looking at developing top 10 tennis players. I think the lessons interworked with that to those outcomes. But I think the most valuable possibility there is that increased engagement, and which allows increased participation and more longevity in the sport, because we're able to mitigate the onset of injuries. We have more enabled children, adolescents, teenagers, young adults that are able to participate in this sport, but also enjoy it. And if they choose to set new benchmarks for the next generation, to current generation, obviously, to progress towards that elite echelon of play. Being a professional is not just knowing what you're talking about. It is also about admitting if you don't know something and working towards finding those answers. That's not too much to ask, is it? I don't think so. Being a professional also comes down to the type of person you represent, whether that be well-mannered, ill-mannered, open-minded, close-minded, willing to help those in need, or ignoring them. You get the picture. These character traits are hard to monitor and need to be recognized and nurtured in the right direction. Now, I think that really surmises just respecting yourself and how it's interworked with that, and the aforementioned discussion on self-worth, because if you value yourself as a person, of course you're going to respect yourself. If you value yourself and you're obviously you're fueling your self-worth in the best possible way, that open-mindedness goes hand in hand, because that wouldn't be possible, so to speak, if you were closed-minded. And because you're self-aware, you're open to helping others opposed to ignoring them. And we have all of these elements of human behavior that really are wrapped up into respecting yourself. And we're looking at the benefits there. If you respect yourself as a coach, the athletes you're working with, the lessons you are imparting on them indirectly, because at the end of the day, you're responsible for working with, whether it's those developmental players, when we're looking at 8, 9, 10 years of age to 15, 16, 17 years of age, and then up when we're looking at the young adults through to 25, 26, 27. Regardless, if you're the adult in the room, it is really you're leading by example. And we've touched on this in a number of episodes and the importance of this. And one of our most recent episodes about mentoring, for example, really touches on this and the benefits there, because you're showing up each and every day to represent yourself, the values you embody, and that child, that learner, that player, that athlete is looking at you with full focus. So if you behave a certain way, of course they're going to think that's how they can behave. And when we're looking at self-worth in particular, if you do not value yourself and respect yourself, there's a very high chance that those children you're working with, or child, that player, that athlete, is going to pick up some of those habits. Potentially not all of those habits, so that's okay, but you, by exuding them, so to say, you are showing them that it's okay to behave a certain way. And that's why it's so important to make sure you are respecting yourself, because the rewards for yourself as a coach are exponential as well. And what you embody is who you are then as a person, and the rewards follow. And when we're looking at specifically the example then you're setting for the player athletes, whether you're working with one or multiple, depending obviously on your setting, if you're in the top 20 and or you're at your local club or academy working with developmental players, of course we know if you're in the top 20 and you have that successful relationship with that athlete, coach-athlete relationship specifically, we know there's a very good chance you have those tools and what you do in fact embody. Though the more discerning part here is for those coaches at the academy to club level, when you're working with juniors specifically on that developmental spectrum, looking to progress towards becoming a professional tennis player, the examples you set, because these are I think the biggest milestones where they are most impressionable, which means your behaviors can have the biggest effect on their performance and obviously that success ratio, which is a little bit shocking on one side if you do not respect yourself as a coach. So we want to hopefully make sure that that's respect metric, if you like, is incredibly high, so you're able to impart those values on your player and that athlete, on the children specifically you're working with, to ensure you're setting themselves up for optimal performance and success, which in and of itself is obviously what we're all talking about. But when we're looking at progressing towards that top 10 tennis ranking, it's underwritten when we're looking at respect as a metric. We have all come across people in businesses who are the opposite of what we would like. As in, they may be ill-mannered opposed to being well-mannered, being a professional, and regardless of what you do, if you are able to encompass the good character traits you wish to see in others, then you are more inclined to respect yourself as a person, right? Yes, you are. You may be asking, what does respecting yourself as a person have to do with respecting yourself as a professional? Let me shed some light. And I think we're going to finish on that one because everything we've just touched on before we dived into the chapter really sums that up. Whether it's, respecting yourself personally to professionally, it's all interrelated there. And how you're really setting that benchmark for those you work with, so specifically the coaches out there, but also the parents. And I haven't really shared or dived into, I think, the applicability today of the parents and or guardians. Obviously that's dependent on your family dynamic there. And it's so important for the parents, and I'm sure I don't need to really underline this as much for the coaches, but it's so important because your behaviors your children will mimic. And that's when we're getting to obviously the body of work here and how human behavior is wrapped into it, and psychology, but also child development, and how that's, I guess, a strain or a division there of psychology, the field of itself. So when we're looking at those behaviors, the developmental process and cycle of a child, how they learn, when they learn, different impressionable behaviors that they are susceptible to. And a lot of my work inadvertently addresses this, but I think I'm very passionate about sharing because I know from irrespective the players, athletes I work with, and when we're looking at, I think, the scope, so the spectrum of child development, and when we specifically take the child and put them in that tennis environment, we want to make sure it's the most conducive and optimal environment to produce that optimal performance. And we know how, and again, incredibly rewarding, but those responsible for imparting that knowledge, so for coaching and the different methods of practice that are responsible for that, and how important that is when we want to accommodate that learner, that child, in that age range. Obviously, when we're looking at the older, so the teenagers to the young adults, they're just as impressionable, just not as susceptible. So there's a very big difference there. But it still means that how the adults in the room, or the coaches to the parents or guardians out there, behave, that there are still those behaviors that they will pick up on. So it's incredibly important. Do you have the respecting yourself as a core value? And again, I think we'll wrap things up by looking at, when we're looking at self-worth, obviously respect is that offshoot there. You want to respect yourself. But sometimes the lines are blurred because, as I touched on very early on, I can put my hand up and say, of course I respect myself, but I was blindsided by really not acknowledging that my self-worth wasn't where I would like it to be. That left me more susceptible and or vulnerable to others and their behaviors, so to say, which is an example about if your self-worth is not being continuously worked on and you are not conscious of that, of course it affects your performance. Of course it affects, the different metrics that you're working on. And of course that's going to have an impact on your respect, so your self-respect there, when we're looking at respecting yourself, whether it is as a coach and or as a player, the athlete, and or as a parent and or guardian, and the implications there for that child and or that player athlete, depending obviously at their their age of development and or stage of development to their rate of progress, and how this can be used specifically to push the marker of that rate of progress to get closer and closer towards that next peak performance cycle that we've touched on in more recent episodes and blog posts. And we want to repeat that. So again, when we've worked on or touched on periodization, and this feeds into that. And who would have thought at the end of the day, when we're looking at elite performance metrics, behavior, your own behavior as a coach, parent, guardian, how it impacts that player athlete, but also the player, the athlete, how your own behaviors are also responsible for those performance outcomes, and what you can do yourself with that intrinsic feedback and extrinsic feedback as examples to work on your own self-worth and your boundaries, irrespective of what age range. It's incredibly very cool to be able to work on that from a young age, because if you can do it now, you're ahead of most adults. And if you're an adult and you're able to set boundaries, and that's exceptional, you're still ahead of most, because most are in the majority, and we're really looking at the minority here, because the minority are the ones who push those boundaries and become those barrier breakers, which I've also touched on in the intro, so some of you may or may not be familiar with that. But again, all those links I will leave in the bio. I think that there are some really key points to run home and to wrap today's episode up on. So we're looking at self-worth, self-respect, and how it's really intertwined and wrapped up in human behavior and the different offshoots, because at the end of the day, if you want to progress towards that elite echelon of play, these are core metrics to consider when we're looking at developing that top 10 tennis player and achieving that top 10 tennis ranking. Thank you so much for listening today. To grab a copy of The Secrets to Optimal Performance Success, head on over to AIM8 International. For any comments or questions, head on over to AIM8 International or to Topic Thread. That's the only social network that I am on. However, beyond Top 10 Tennis, please come and interact with us. We are on Twitter, Threads, LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok, Medium. Oh my goodness. To catch up on our weekly coaching tips, head on over to TikTok, but they're also shared on the other platforms. And to catch up on our blogs, head on over, like I said, to Medium, and AIM8 International has them there under our blog section. And as always, I will leave all the links in the episode notes. Oh, that was a lot. We really wrapped up today's episode a bit, I think, not necessarily quickly. It was a lot packed into today's episode, but I really hope, if anything, that you're going to take away working on your self-worth, those boundaries, and how it really is interworked in your self-respect. And so obviously respecting yourself, whether that is from a coach's standpoint, a parent's and or guardian standpoint, or player athlete standpoint. It is so incredibly important. For something different, head on over to Pink Octopus Books. That's where my fictional release is. To view this week's question and poll, be sure to visit Spotify if you are listening on one of the other platforms. Or for something left of field, visit Spruik for some random polls. And if you do visit Spruik, I'd love to hear your feedback. And of course, if you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, like, share, and all of the above would be absolutely phenomenal. And for those of you who are interested, we do have scholarships available on and at AIM8 International, as well as options to work with me exclusively to optimize your performance, to nudge a little bit closer towards that top 10 tennis ranking. So don't be shy, come and say hi. On that note, thank you so much for listening. I am so incredibly grateful. I'm your host, Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge, and this is Beyond Top 10 Tennis, and I'll see you next time.